The cold water of the Colorado River hit Theodora Langford's face like a slap from God himself as the ferry lurched beneath her feet, and she knew with absolute certainty that she was going to die in Arizona territory on this blistering afternoon in June of 1878. The wooden planks beneath her boots tilted at an impossible angle, sending barrels and crates sliding toward the churning brown water below. Other passengers screamed and clutched at the rope railings, while the boatman cursed loud enough to be heard over the roar of the current. The ferry had been crossing the Colorado for 20 years according to the faded sign at the landing, but apparently today was the day its luck ran out. Theodora grabbed for the nearest post as water rushed over the deck, soaking her traveling dress and petticoats until they clung to her legs like iron chains. She had left St. Louis 3 weeks ago with nothing but 2 trunks and a teaching certificate, determined to start fresh in the mining town of Mineral Park, where her cousin had secured her a position at the schoolhouse. Now it seemed she would never see that schoolhouse or anything else beyond this muddy river. The ferry groaned like a dying animal as more water poured through a split in the hull. The boatman was still yelling something about everyone staying calm, but his voice had taken on a panicked edge that made Theodora's heart hammer against her ribs. An elderly woman beside her lost her grip and stumbled toward the edge. Theodora lunged forward and caught her arm, pulling her back just as a wave crashed over the railing. Then she saw him. A man stood at the far end of the ferry, tall and broad-shouldered with dark hair that fell past his collar. He wore buckskin pants and a rough cotton shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. While everyone else scrambled in terror, he moved with deliberate purpose, his eyes scanning the sinking vessel with the calm assessment of someone who had faced death before and found it less impressive than advertised. Their eyes met across the chaos, and something passed between them in that moment. His gaze was the color of storm clouds, steady and measuring. Then he was moving toward her, his boots sure on the tilting deck even as water sloshed around his ankles.
"Can you swim?"
His voice was deep and rough like stones grinding together. "I what?" Theodora struggled to process the question as another wave crashed over them. "Can you swim?" he repeated, already reaching for her. His hands closed around her waist, and she felt the solid strength of him through her soaked dress. "A little, but my skirts do not matter." He pulled a knife from his belt, and before she could protest, he was cutting through the fabric at her waist. Her heavy traveling dress fell away in pieces, leaving her in just her chemise and one petticoat. The impropriety of it barely registered through her fear. "Wait, I cannot just..." The ferry lurched again, this time listing so far to one side that people began sliding into the water. The boatman was still yelling, something about holding on, about rescue, but his words were lost in the screaming and the roar of the river. The mountain man, because that was clearly what he was, one of those solitary souls who lived in the high country and came to civilization only when necessity demanded. It wrapped one powerful arm around her waist. "Take a breath," he commanded. But then they were in the water. The current seized them immediately, trying to tear her from his grip and drag her under. Theodora gasped and choked as water filled her mouth and nose. She threatened instinctively, but his arm only tightened around her. "Stop fighting," he said, his mouth close to her ear. Somehow his voice cut through her panic. "I have got you. Just breathe when I tell you." She forced herself to go still, to trust this stranger who had appeared from nowhere. His body was warm despite the cold water, solid and unyielding against her back as he began swimming with powerful one-armed strokes. His legs kicked beneath them, propelling them through the current with shocking efficiency. "Breathe," he ordered, and she gulped air just before a wave crashed over them. He angled his body to take the brunt of it, shielding her. When they surfaced again, she could see the shore getting closer, though it seemed impossibly far away. Behind them, the boatman was still yelling, his voice carrying across the water. She caught fragments of his words, something about fools and lawsuits in his ferry, but they seemed absurd given the circumstances. The ferry itself was half submerged now, its deck vertical as it began to slip beneath the surface. Other passengers floundered in the water, some managing to keep afloat, others already sinking beneath the brown current. "Should we not help them?" Theodora gasped during another brief moment above water. "Cannot help anyone if we drown first," he said grimly. "Shore first, then we can throw ropes." His logic was sound even if it felt cruel. Theodora tried to kick her legs to help, but her waterlogged petticoat kept tangling around her knees. The mountain man noticed, and without breaking his swimming rhythm, he reached down and tore the fabric away with his bare hands. The strength required for such a feat while treading water and fighting the current was staggering. Now, in just her thin chemise, Theodora felt the full force of the water against her skin, but she could also move her legs freely. She began kicking in rhythm with his strokes, and their progress toward shore increased. "That is it," he said, approval warming his rough voice. "Keep that up." They swam for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Theodora's muscles burned and her lungs ached, but she kept kicking, kept breathing when he told her to, kept trusting this stranger who had chosen to save her when he could have easily saved himself. Finally, blessedly, her foot scraped against the rocky bottom. The mountain man found his footing and lifted her bodily out of the water, carrying her the last few yards to the muddy bank. He set her down gently on the shore, and Theodora collapsed onto her hands and knees. Coughing up river water and gasping for air, he knelt beside her, one large hand resting between her shoulder blades. "Easy now, get it all out." When she could finally breathe again, Theodora looked up at him. Water streamed from his dark hair, and his shirt clung to a torso that looked like it had been carved from granite. His face was weathered and tanned, with a strong jaw darkened by several days of stubble and a straight nose that had probably been broken at least once. He was perhaps 28 or 30, though it was hard to tell with men who lived hard lives in wild country. "You saved my life," she said, her voice hoarse. He shrugged, already turning to scan the river. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Theodora said firmly. "They would not have. Most people would have saved themselves." He glanced back at her, and for the first time, she saw the hint of a smile soften his hard features. "Then I guess I am not most people, clearly not. I am Theodora Langford, Logan Xavier." He offered his hand and she took it, feeling the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. His grip was careful despite his obvious strength, as if he was aware he could crush her fingers without effort. "I owe you my life, Mr. Xavier Logan," he corrected. "And you do not owe me anything, Miss Langford." "Theodora," she said. "Given that you have seen me in my undergarments, I think we can dispense with excessive formality." That earned her an actual laugh, rough and unpracticed, but genuine. The sound did something strange to her chest, made her heart skip in a way that had nothing to do with their near drowning. The moment was broken by screams from the river. They both turned to see other passengers still struggling in the water. The ferry had disappeared entirely beneath the surface, and the boatman was clinging to a piece of debris. Still shouting about his ruined business, Logan was already moving, striding down the bank to where a coil of rope had washed ashore, probably from the ferry's cargo. He grabbed it and waded back into the shallows, calling out to the nearest swimmer. Theodora struggled to her feet, ignoring the way her soaked chemise clung to every curve of her body. There was no time for modesty. She found another piece of rope and followed Logan's example, throwing one end to a woman who was barely keeping her head above water. Together they pulled survivors to shore one by one. Logan made 2 more trips into the deeper water to retrieve passengers who could not make it on their own, his powerful swimming cutting through the current with the same confidence he had shown when rescuing Theodora. By the time the last person was accounted for, the sun had moved considerably across the sky and Theodora was shivering despite the Arizona heat. A total of 15 people had been on the ferry. 13 made it to shore, including the boatman, who immediately began complaining about the loss of his vessel and demanding to know who was going to pay for the damages. Logan ignored him completely, which Theodora found immensely satisfying. 2 passengers had been lost to the river, a gambler from Denver and a prospector heading back to California. Their absence hung heavy over the survivors, a reminder of how close they all had come to the same fate. Logan shed his wet shirt and draped it over Theodora's shoulders without asking permission. The garment was soaked but still warmer than the thin chemise, and it smelled like river water and pine and something distinctly masculine that made her feel oddly safe. "Thank you," she said, pulling the shirt closed around herself. "You are shaking," he said it as simple fact, not criticism. "I nearly drowned. It seems a reasonable response." "Fair enough." He turned to address the other survivors. "Mineral Park is about 8 miles north along this road. We need to get moving before dark. Anyone injured who cannot walk." A few people had minor cuts and bruises, but everyone could move. The elderly woman Theodora had helped on the ferry had wrenched her ankle, so Logan fashioned a walking stick from a piece of driftwood and offered his arm for support. They set off in a bedraggled group, following the rutted dirt road north. Theodora walked beside Logan, acutely aware that she was wearing nothing but a chemise and his shirt, but there was no help for it. Her trunks were somewhere at the bottom of the Colorado River, along with all her other possessions. Everything she owned in the world was now what she carried on her body, which amounted to essentially nothing. The reality of her situation began to sink in as they walked. She had no clothes, no money, no way to prove who she was or why she had come to Arizona territory. Her teaching certificate had been in her trunk. The letter from her cousin promising her the teaching position had been in her reticule, which was also lost. "You have gone quiet," Logan observed after they had walked perhaps a mile. "I am considering my circumstances," Theodora said. "I came here to be a teacher in Mineral Park. My cousin secured me a position. But all my documents, all my proof of who I am, all my belongings, everything is gone. Your cousin will vouch for you. I suppose, if I can find him. I have never actually met him in person. We have only corresponded by letter." Logan was silent for a moment, his long strides eating up the dusty road. What is his name? Samuel Langford. He is the assayer in Mineral Park. I know Sam. Logan's voice held a note of approval. Good man. Honest, which is rare in the mining business. He will help you get situated. Relief washed through Theodora. You know him, truly? I bring him ore samples sometimes. Got a claim up in the Serbet Mountains. He gestured vaguely to the peaks visible in the distance, purple and hazy in the afternoon heat. You are a prospector then, among other things. I trap in winter, prospect in summer, hunt year-round. Whatever keeps me in coffee and ammunition. Theodora studied his profile as they walked. He had the weathered look of someone who spent all his time outdoors, but there was an intelligence in his eyes that suggested more education than she would have expected from a mountain man. His speech, while rough, was grammatically correct and his vocabulary was that of someone who had read books. You sound like a man who has seen some schooling, she ventured. Logan's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. My mother was a teacher. She made sure I knew my letters and numbers before the fever took her. I am sorry, it was a long time ago. He said it in a way that closed the subject, and Theodora let it drop. They walked in companionable silence for a while. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the road into an oven, but at least their wet clothes provided some cooling as they dried. Theodora became aware that Logan kept angling himself to walk slightly ahead and to her right, positioning his body between her and the other survivors. It was a subtle thing, almost unconscious, but it spoke to a protective instinct that was both touching and thrilling. The elderly woman Logan was helping Mrs. Henderson. She had introduced herself, kept up a steady stream of chatter despite her injured ankle. She was heading to Mineral Park to live with her daughter and son-in-law who ran the general store. Theodora found herself grateful for the woman's conversation as it kept her mind off her aching legs and increasingly sunburned shoulders. By the time the sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and gold, the bedraggled group finally spotted the buildings of Mineral Park in the distance. The mining town was larger than Theodora had expected, with several streets of wooden buildings and the dark maw of mine shafts visible in the hills beyond. As they entered the main street, doors began opening, and people emerged to stare at the waterlogged procession. News of the ferry disaster must have already reached town, because a man in a suit came hurrying toward them, a medical bag in hand. Dr. Morrison, Logan said by way of greeting. Got some folks here who could use looking over. The doctor began triaging the survivors immediately, ushering the worst off toward what was presumably his office. Theodora hung back, suddenly uncertain. She was painfully aware of her scandalous state of dress, or undress rather, and the curious stares from the townspeople. Miss Langford? A man's voice, educated and concerned. Theodora turned to see a lean man in his 40s with spectacles and thinning brown hair hurrying toward her. Miss Theodora Langford? Cousin Samuel? Relief flooded through her at his familiar face, even though they had never met. He looked exactly like his father, her uncle, whose photograph her mother had kept. Samuel Langford took in her appearance: Logan's oversized shirt, her bare legs, her tangled wet hair, and his expression shifted from concern to understanding. The ferry, we heard. Good Lord, we thought when they said 2 people were lost. We feared. He seemed to run out of words and simply pulled her into an embrace. Theodora had not realized how much she needed that simple gesture of familial affection until it happened. She sagged against her cousin, exhaustion finally overtaking her now that she had reached safety. This man saved my life, she said, pulling back and gesturing to Logan, who stood a respectful distance away, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the emotional reunion. Logan Xavier. He swam me to shore when the ferry went down. Samuel turned to Logan and extended his hand. Sam Langford. I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Xavier. If there is anything I can do. No need, Logan said, shaking the offered hand briefly. Just happened to be on the same ferry is all. Nevertheless, you have my gratitude. Samuel turned back to Theodora. Come, let me get you home. My wife Margaret will have you sorted out in no time. You can tell us everything once you have had a chance to rest and change into proper clothes. Theodora looked back at Logan, feeling strangely reluctant to leave his presence. He had been her anchor through the terror of the drowning, the solid presence that kept her safe. Walking away from him felt wrong somehow, like leaving something unfinished. Thank you, she said, putting as much meaning into the words as she could. I will never forget what you did for me today, Logan Xavier. Something flickered in his storm-gray eyes, some emotion she could not quite name. You did well out there, Theodora Langford. Not many city women would have kept their heads like you did. I am from St. Louis, not some fragile hothouse flower. The corner of his mouth quirked up. I can see that. Then Samuel was gently guiding her away, and she forced herself not to look back even though every instinct urged her to do so. Samuel and Margaret Langford lived in a neat house on the edge of town, painted white with green shutters that were purely decorative since the windows had no glass, just screens to keep out the worst of the insects. Margaret was a plump, motherly woman in her late 30s who took one look at the Theodora and immediately sprang into action, heating water for a bath and producing a simple cotton dress that would fit well enough until proper clothes could be made or purchased. Soaking in the copper tub set up in a corner of the kitchen, Theodora finally allowed herself to process everything that had happened. Her hands were shaking again, and she realized it was delayed shock. She had nearly died today. If not for Logan Xavier, she would be at the bottom of the Colorado River right now, one more casualty of the dangerous frontier. But it was not just gratitude she felt when she thought of him. There was something else, something that had sparked to life when their eyes met across that sinking ferry. She had never believed in love at first sight, had always thought it a ridiculous notion, suitable only for penny dreadfuls and romantic poetry. Yet she could not deny that something had happened in those few intense hours, something significant. "You are wool-gathering," Margaret said kindly, appearing with a towel warmed by the stove. "Understandable, given the day you have had. Let me help you with your hair." Theodora submitted to Margaret's gentle ministrations, letting the older woman work the tangles from her long brown hair. By the time she was dressed and presentable, night had fallen completely, and Samuel had a simple meal waiting: salt pork, beans, and cornbread, frontier fare but filling and warm. Over dinner, Theodora recounted the story of the ferry disaster, with Samuel and Margaret listening in horrified fascination. When she described how Logan had cut away her dress and swum her to shore, Margaret gasped. "That Logan Xavier is quite something," Margaret said meaningfully. "Lives alone up in the mountains, comes to town maybe once a month for supplies. Keeps to himself mostly, but everyone knows he is honest and reliable. Not to mention handsome as sin, though he seems not to notice when women try to catch his eye." "Margaret," Samuel said mildly, though his eyes twinkled with amusement. "Well, it is true. Half the unmarried women in Mineral Park have tried to interest him at one time or another, and quite a few of the married ones too, shame on them. He is always polite but never shows a lick of interest. Lives for his mountains and his solitude, that one." Theodora felt an absurd little twist of jealousy at the idea of other women pursuing Logan, which was ridiculous given that she had known the man for all of a few hours. She focused on her food and tried to change the subject. "About my teaching position," she began. Samuel winced. "Ah, yes. I am afraid there have been some complications with that." Theodora's heart sank. "Complications?" "The school board hired someone else last week, a widow from Prescott with teaching experience. I tried to explain that you were on your way, but they would not wait. I am terribly sorry. My dear, your letter must have been delayed. I only received it 2 weeks ago, and by then the board had already made their decision." The news hit Theodora like a physical blow. No teaching position, no money, no prospects. She was entirely dependent on her cousin's charity in a rough mining town where respectable work for women was scarce. "I see," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "That is unfortunate." "We will figure something out," Margaret said firmly. "You will stay with us, of course, and perhaps something will open up. There is talk of starting a second school if the town keeps growing. I cannot impose on your hospitality indefinitely." "Nonsense. You are family." Samuel's tone brooked no argument. "We will work out the details in time. For now, you need rest. Tomorrow we can see about replacing your lost belongings and determining what comes next." Theodora wanted to argue, to insist on her independence, but exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. Margaret showed her to a small bedroom, "Our son's room, but he is away working a claim in California, so you are welcome to it." And Theodora collapsed onto the narrow bed, asleep almost before her head hit the pillow. She dreamed of cold water and strong arms, of storm-gray eyes and a voice commanding her to breathe. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Word of the ferry disaster had spread through Mineral Park and the surrounding territory, drawing curiosity seekers and concerned citizens alike. The 2 men who had drowned were identified and their families notified. The boatman was already talking about salvaging what he could from the wreck and building a new ferry, complaining loudly about his losses to anyone who would listen. Theodora found herself something of a local celebrity simply by virtue of surviving. People stopped her on the street to hear her account of the disaster, and she told the story so many times it began to feel rehearsed. Always she made sure to credit Logan Xavier with saving her life, though the man himself was nowhere to be seen. "He went back to his claim," Samuel explained when Theodora finally asked. "Usually stays up in the mountains for weeks at a time. I would not expect to see him again until he needs more supplies or has ore to assay." The news disappointed Theodora more than it should have. She had hoped to see Logan again, to thank him properly now that she was in her right mind and properly dressed. And if she was honest with herself, she simply wanted to see him again, period. Margaret took Theodora shopping at the general store, Mrs. Henderson's daughter's establishment, and helped her purchase the basic necessities: 2 simple dresses, undergarments, a bonnet, and sturdy boots. Samuel insisted on paying, waving away Theodora's protests about debts and repayment. You are family, he said simply. This is what family does. The general store turned out to be a treasure trove of information as well as goods. Mrs. Henderson's daughter, Dorothy, was a cheerful woman about Theodora's age 22, and she seemed to know everyone's business. That Logan Xavier is a mystery and no mistake, Dorothy said when Theodora casually inquired about him. Been here going on 5 years now, keeps entirely to himself. Some say he is running from something back east, maybe a wife or the law, but I do not believe it. He is too honest a face for that. Has he always been a prospector? Theodora asked, trying to sound only mildly curious. Far as I know. Has a claim somewhere up near the peak, no one knows exactly where because he does not talk about it. Finds enough gold to keep himself supplied but nothing to get rich on. I think he likes the solitude more than the prospecting, truth be told. Margaret shot Theodora a knowing look but said nothing until they were outside with their packages. You are interested in him, Margaret said. It was not a question. He saved my life. Of course I am interested in thanking him properly. And is that all? Theodora felt heat rise to her cheeks. I barely know the man. Sometimes that is when you know the most important things. Margaret patted her arm. Logan Xavier is a good man, Theodora. Rough around the edges and probably set in his ways, but good. If you have caught his attention, that is no small thing. I doubt I have caught anything except his sense of duty. I saw the way he looked at you when Samuel took you home. That was not duty in his eyes, my dear. Theodora wanted to believe her cousin's wife, but as days stretched into a week with no sign of Logan, she began to think Margaret was seeing things that were not there. Logan had moved on, back to his solitary life in the mountains, and she needed to focus on her own uncertain future. The problem was that there was not much future to focus on. Mineral Park had plenty of saloons and gaming halls, but little need for school teachers. Margaret suggested Theodora might work in the general store, but Dorothy already had more help than she needed, with her husband and her mother both working there. The only other respectable employment for women seemed to be taking in laundry or sewing, and both occupations were already well covered by the town's existing residents. Theodora was beginning to feel desperate and useless, a burden on her cousin's household, despite their protestations to the contrary. When Logan Xavier walked into the assay office on a bright July morning, Theodora happened to be there, helping Samuel organize his files, busy work to make her feel useful. When the door opened and Logan ducked through, a leather bag slung over one broad shoulder. He wore the same buckskin pants and rough cotton shirt, though both looked cleaner than they had been on the ferry. His dark hair was still long, brushing his collar, and his jaw was darkened by stubble that was almost a beard. Their eyes met, and Theodora felt that same jolt she had experienced on the ferry, like touching something electric. Logan stopped just inside the door, his gray eyes widening slightly with surprise. Theodora, her name in his rough voice, sent shivers down her spine. Logan, she was absurdly pleased that he had used her given name without prompting. It is good to see you again. Likewise. He seemed about to say more but glanced at Samuel and apparently thought better of it. Instead, he moved to the counter and set down his bag. Got some samples for you, Sam. 3 different veins I have been working. Samuel greeted Logan warmly and began the process of examining the ore samples, weighing and testing them with the careful precision of his trade. Theodora knew she should probably leave, this was business, after all, but she found herself rooted to the spot, unable to stop watching Logan. He stood with the easy stillness of someone comfortable in his own body, his weight balanced, his hands loose at his sides. Everything about him spoke of controlled strength and confidence. When he glanced at her, which he did several times during the assay process, his expression was difficult to read. Interest, certainly, but also something that might have been uncertainty, as if he was not sure what to make of her presence. Good ore, Samuel finally pronounced. The second sample especially. That vein might be worth pursuing more aggressively. I can give you $40 for this lot. Logan nodded, accepting the payment Samuel counted out from his strongbox. Then he hesitated, his gaze sliding to Theodora again. I heard the teaching position did not work out, he said. That is rough luck. News travels fast in a small town, Theodora said. You doing all right? You and your cousin working something out? The fact that he had been thinking about her situation, that he cared enough to ask, made Theodora's heart beat faster. We are managing, though I confess I feel rather useless at the moment. I am not accustomed to being idle. Logan was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. Then he said, almost reluctantly, I might have something if you are interested. Both Theodora and Samuel looked at him with surprise. What kind of something? Theodora asked. My mother's books. I have maybe 3 dozen of them up at my cabin. She taught me from them, and I have kept them all these years, but they are just gathering dust. Seems a waste. He was not quite meeting her eyes now, as if embarrassed by the admission. Thought maybe you could use them. Teach children privately maybe, or start your own school eventually. Books are valuable out here. The offer was so unexpected and so thoughtful that Theodora felt her throat tighten with emotion. Logan, I could not possibly. Those are your mother's books. They must mean the world to you. They would mean more being used for their purpose. He finally looked at her directly, his gray eyes serious. She would have wanted that. She believed education was the most important thing a person could have. Then I would be honored to have them. Thank you. Logan nodded, looking relieved that she had accepted. I will bring them down next time I come to town. Though that might be a few weeks, yet I need to work my claim while the weather holds. I will be here, Theodora said softly. Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding that this was about more than just books. Samuel cleared his throat diplomatically, pretending to be absorbed in his paperwork. Well then, Logan said, settling his hat back on his head. I should be getting my supplies and heading back up the mountain. Good to see you looking well, Theodora. And you, Logan. He left with a final nod to Samuel, and Theodora watched through the window as his tall figure strode down the dusty street toward the general store. Her heart was doing complicated things in her chest. That was interesting, Samuel said mildly. What was? Logan Xavier does not talk to people unless he absolutely has to. And he certainly does not offer to give away his mother's books. Those have been up at his cabin for at least 5 years to my knowledge. He is just being kind. He saved my life. And now he is trying to help me establish myself here. Samuel gave her a look that suggested he thought she was being deliberately obtuse. Logan Xavier is many things, but charitable is not typically one of them. Not because he is unkind, but because he simply does not involve himself in other people's affairs until now, apparently. Theodora wanted to argue, but she could not quite manage it. Because Samuel was right, there was something developing between her and Logan, something tentative and new but undeniably real. The question was what, if anything, either of them was going to do about it. The answer came 3 weeks later when Logan returned to town, not with ore samples but with a sturdy pack mule loaded with wooden crates. Theodora was hanging laundry in the yard behind Samuel's house when she heard Margaret call out that she had a visitor. She came around to the front to find Logan standing beside the laden mule, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the attention he was drawing from curious passers-by. When he saw Theodora, relief crossed his weathered features. Brought your books, he said without preamble. Hope I did not pick a bad time. No, this is perfect. I was just... She gestured vaguely at the laundry and then felt foolish. Let me help you unload them. Between the two of them, they carried the crates into the house. Logan had packed the books carefully, wrapping them in oilcloth to protect against moisture. When Theodora opened the first crate and saw the titles Shakespeare, Dickens, arithmetic primers, geography texts, moral philosophy, poetry collections, she felt tears prick her eyes. These are wonderful, she breathed, running her fingers reverently over the leather bindings. Many of the books were old and worn, clearly read many times. Your mother must have been an extraordinary woman. She was. Logan's voice was soft with memory. She taught in Boston before she married my father. He brought her out to Colorado Territory, but she never stopped teaching. She would gather the local children and hold lessons in our cabin. What happened to her? Theodora asked gently. Fever, when I was 12. My father followed her 6 months later. I have been on my own since then, more or less. The matter-of-fact way he said it broke Theodora's heart. 12 years old and orphaned, forced to survive alone in the brutal frontier. No wonder he had grown into such a solitary, self-sufficient man. I am so sorry, Logan. He shrugged, clearly uncomfortable with sympathy. It was a long time ago. Point is, these books should be used. If you can teach even one child to read, my mother would consider that a life well spent. Theodora made a decision in that moment. Stay for supper, please. It is the least I can do to thank you, and Margaret always makes far too much food. Logan hesitated, and she could see the instinct to refuse, to retreat back to his solitary mountain. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. All right, he said. Supper sounds good. Margaret was delighted to have a guest, and she immediately set about making the meal: special fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans from her garden, and apple pie made from precious dried apples. Samuel produced a bottle of whiskey he had been saving for a special occasion, and they ate at the dining table rather than the kitchen, using the good dishes. Logan was clearly uncomfortable with the formality at first, but he gradually relaxed as the conversation flowed. He told stories about life in the mountains, encounters with bears, the challenges of surviving brutal winters, the satisfaction of finding a good vein of ore. He was an excellent storyteller when he chose to be, his deep voice painting vivid pictures. Theodora found herself watching the way his hands moved when he talked, broad and scarred and capable, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which was rarely but all the more striking for its infrequency. The way he listened when others spoke, giving his complete attention as if their words were the most important thing in the world. After supper, Samuel and Margaret diplomatically decided they needed to visit a neighbor, leaving Theodora and Logan alone on the front porch as the summer evening cooled. They sat in the 2 rocking chairs Samuel had made, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and purple behind the Serbet Mountains. "This is nice," Logan said after a while, "being with people. I forget sometimes." "Do you get lonely up there?" Theodora asked. He considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. Mostly I am too busy to think about it. But there are long winter nights when the snow is so deep you cannot go anywhere and the silence is so complete it feels like you are the last person on earth. Those nights can be hard. Why do you stay then? You could live in town, prospect during the day, and come back to a warm house and neighbors. Town makes me feel crowded. Too many people, too much noise, too many expectations." He paused. "My father was like that too. Could not abide being hemmed in. My mother loved him enough to follow him into the wilderness, even though it meant giving up everything she knew." "That is a powerful love," Theodora said softly. "It is." Logan turned to look at her directly. "I have thought about you, Theodora, since the ferry, probably more than I should." Her breath caught. "I have thought about you too. I am not good at this," he said bluntly. "Talking to women, courtship, whatever you want to call it. I have been alone so long I am not sure I remember how to be any other way." "You are doing fine so far," Theodora said, her heart racing. "The thing is, I cannot offer you much. A cabin in the mountains with no neighbors for miles. Hard work and harder winters. It is not the life most women would want." "Are you asking me what kind of life I want, Logan Xavier?" He stood up from his rocking chair and paced to the edge of the porch, his back to her. "I am asking if you might consider that there could be something between us. I know it is too soon, we barely know each other. But I have never felt like this before, and I think you might feel it too." Theodora rose and went to stand beside him. "I do feel it. Since the moment you pulled me from that ferry, I have not been able to stop thinking about you. But Logan, I am a practical woman. We do need to know each other better, and I have my own life to build here. I cannot just abandon everything and run off to your mountain cabin like some character in a romantic novel." He smiled at that, a real smile that transformed his serious face. "I would not ask you to. We do this proper. I come to town more often, we spend time together, see if this thing between us is real or just the aftermath of a dramatic rescue. That sounds sensible. Though for what it is worth," Logan said, turning to face her fully, "I already know it is real, at least on my side." Before Theodora could respond, he leaned down and kissed her. His lips were surprisingly soft despite his weathered appearance, and the kiss was gentle, almost tentative, as if he was afraid she might pull away. Instead, Theodora leaned into him, her hands coming up to rest on his broad chest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms, strong and sure. When they finally broke apart, Logan rested his forehead against hers. "Been wanting to do that since I carried you to shore," he admitted. "Then you should have done it sooner," Theodora said, and pulled him down for another kiss. Over the following months, Logan Xavier courted Theodora Langford with a single-minded determination that surprised everyone in Mineral Park who knew him. He came to town every week instead of every month, timing his visits for Sundays when Samuel's assay office was closed. He would arrive in the morning, freshly shaved and wearing his cleanest clothes, and spend the day with Theodora. They took long walks through the countryside, Logan teaching her to identify different plants and animal tracks. They picnicked by the creek that fed the town's water supply, sitting in the shade of cottonwood trees and talking about everything and nothing. He told her about his childhood in Colorado, about learning to trap and hunt from his father, about the long months after his parents died when he had survived on stubbornness and luck. Theodora told him about growing up in St. Louis, the youngest of 4 sisters, about her father's death from consumption when she was 16, and how her mother had remarried a year later to a man who made it clear that Theodora and her sisters were unwelcome burdens, about saving money from sewing work to put herself through normal school, determined to have a profession and independence. "That is why teaching means so much to you," Logan said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "It is not just a job, it is your freedom." "Yes," Theodora said, grateful that he understood. "And losing the position here felt like losing that freedom all over again." "You will teach again," Logan said with absolute certainty. "Maybe not in a schoolhouse, but you will teach. I can see it in you that need to share knowledge to help others learn. It is who you are." His faith in her meant more than Theodora could express. While she waited for another teaching opportunity to present itself, she began offering private lessons to children whose parents could afford to pay. It was not much, but it gave her purpose and a small income of her own. She used Logan's mother's books, and every time she opened one, she felt connected to both Logan and the woman who had raised him. The books themselves proved to be full of surprises. One day, while preparing a geography lesson, Theodora discovered a pressed flower tucked between the pages, its petals still holding faint color despite the years. Another time, she found a note in neat handwriting. For Logan, when he is old enough to appreciate it. With all my love, Mother. It was tucked into a volume of Tennyson's poetry. She showed Logan the note during one of his visits. He held the slip of paper carefully, his rough fingers gentle with the delicate remnant of his past. She loved poetry, he said quietly. Used to read it aloud in the evenings. My father would pretend to grumble about it, but I could tell he liked hearing her voice. She sounds like she was wonderful. She was. You would have liked her, and she would have loved you. The comment was casual, but it implied a future, a world where Theodora might have met Logan's mother. It was these little glimpses of his imagination, the way he unconsciously included her in his vision of life, that made Theodora fall deeper in love with him. Because she was in love with him, she realized one October evening as they sat on Samuel's porch watching the first stars appear. Logan was telling her about the golden aspens up in the high country, how the entire mountainside turned gold in autumn, and the way his eyes lit up when he described it made her heart ache with affection and longing. She was in love with this rough, solitary man who had pulled her from a river and into his carefully guarded heart. The question was what they were going to do about it. The answer came in early November, when Logan arrived in town with a serious expression and a question that had clearly taken considerable courage to ask. "Come up to my cabin," he said without preamble. "Before the snow gets too deep, I want you to see where I live, how I live. I want you to know what you would be choosing if—" He stopped, looking uncharacteristically uncertain. "If I chose you," Theodora finished gently, "yes." Margaret and Samuel were initially concerned about propriety. An unmarried woman visiting a man's cabin in the mountains was scandalous by any standard, but Logan promised they would bring along Mrs. Henderson as a chaperone, and Samuel would come as well. They would make it a proper expedition, all above board. So on a crisp November morning with the sky a brilliant blue and the air sharp with approaching winter, they set out. Logan led the way on his horse, with Theodora riding behind Samuel on his mare and Mrs. Henderson surprisingly spry on a rented mule. The trail wound up into the Surbet Mountains, climbing through scrub brush and scattered pines that grew thicker as they gained elevation. Logan pointed out landmarks: a distinctive rock formation, a spring that ran year-round, the place where he had once surprised a mountain lion. "You killed it?" Mrs. Henderson asked with a mixture of horror and fascination. "No, madam. We both decided we had better places to be and went our separate ways." The cabin, when they finally reached it after several hours of riding, was not what Theodora had expected. She had imagined something rough and temporary, a prospector's shack barely adequate for survival. Instead, Logan's home was a solid structure of logs chinked with mud and moss, with a stone chimney and real glass windows. A covered porch ran along the front, and there was a separate shed for his mule and tools. Inside, the single room was sparse but scrupulously clean. An iron stove for heating and cooking occupied one corner with a neat stack of firewood beside it. A handmade bed with a thick quilt took up another corner, and rough-hewn shelves held supplies: flour, salt, coffee, ammunition, and various tools. A table and 2 chairs sat near the windows, positioned to catch the light. But what drew Theodora's attention was the small bookshelf beside the bed. It held perhaps a dozen volumes, clearly the ones Logan had kept when he gave her the rest of his mother's collection. And on the wall above the bed hung a small framed portrait, a woman with intelligent eyes and a gentle smile. Logan's mother. "It is wonderful," Theodora said, meaning it. The cabin was small and isolated, but it was well built and thoughtfully arranged. This was not just a place to survive, it was a home. Logan's relief was visible. "It gets lonely up here," he admitted, "especially in winter when the snow is deep, but it is peaceful too. Clean, simple." They spent the afternoon exploring the area around the cabin. Logan showed her his claim, pointing out where he had been working the vein of gold-bearing quartz. He took them to an overlook where you could see for miles, all the way to Mineral Park on one side and deep into the wilderness on the other. "This is where I come to think," he said to Theodora when the others had wandered a bit away. "When I am trying to work through something difficult." "What do you think about?" Theodora asked. "Lately? You." He took her hand, lacing his scarred fingers through her smaller ones. "Whether I have any right to ask you to share this life. Whether you could be happy here. I think," Theodora said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "that happiness is not about place, it is about people. I would miss teaching in a formal school. I would miss the bustle and convenience of town living, but I would miss you more if I did not choose this." Logan's hand tightened on hers. "You are saying yes to something I have not even asked yet. Then perhaps you should ask." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes serious and intent. "Theodora Langford, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? I promise I will do everything in my power to make you happy. I will build you bookshelves for your teaching materials and ride to town whenever you need to see people. I will learn to be less rough around the edges and more the kind of man a woman like you deserves. I will love you with everything I have, for as long as I live." Theodora felt tears spill down her cheeks. "Yes," she said. Yes, Logan Xavier, I will marry you, and you do not need to change anything about yourself. I fell in love with the man you are, not some polished version you think I need. He kissed her then, deeply and thoroughly, and Theodora felt like she was falling all over again, but this time she knew exactly who would catch her. They were married in Mineral Park 3 weeks later, on a cold December day with snow threatening in the heavy gray clouds. The ceremony was held in the largest building in town, the Masonic Hall, since Mineral Park did not yet have a proper church. Samuel gave Theodora away, and Margaret cried happy tears throughout the entire service. Theodora wore a dress of deep blue wool that Margaret had helped her make, practical and warm rather than frilly. Logan wore a new suit purchased from the general store, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the formal clothes. But when the circuit preacher pronounced them man and wife, the joy on his face was unmistakable. The whole town turned out for the celebration that followed. Dorothy from the general store had organized a community dinner with everyone contributing dishes. There was music and dancing, with Logan surprising everyone by being a competent dancer, though he insisted he was rusty. My mother taught me, he admitted when Theodora commented on his skill. She said a gentleman should know how to dance, even if he lived in the wilderness. Your mother was a wise woman. She would have loved you, Logan said again. And this time Theodora understood it was not just an idle comment but a deep truth. His mother had been the most important person in his life, and comparing Theodora to her was the highest compliment he could offer. As evening fell and snow began to drift down in fat white flakes, Logan and Theodora said their goodbyes and began the journey up to the cabin. Logan had prepared for this, stocking extra supplies and making sure everything was ready for Theodora's arrival. They rode together on his horse, Theodora wrapped in a heavy cloak and pressed against Logan's broad back for warmth. The cabin glowed with welcoming firelight when they arrived. Logan had made the trip up early that morning to light the stove and make sure everything was perfect. He lifted Theodora down from the horse and carried her over the threshold in the traditional manner, though he bumped her head slightly on the doorframe and apologized profusely. I am fine, Theodora laughed, touching the spot. Though you might need to remember I am taller than the average bride. I will remember, Logan promised, setting her down gently. I will remember everything about you. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, with Logan proving to be a considerate and attentive lover despite his rough exterior. Afterward, they lay together in the narrow bed, Theodora's head on Logan's broad chest, listening to the wind howl outside and the fire crackle in the stove. Are you scared? Logan asked quietly. About living up here, away from everything? A little, Theodora admitted. But more excited than scared, and I have you, which makes all the difference. You do, Logan said fiercely. You have me, always. I will never let anything happen to you. Theodora thought back to that day on the ferry, to the certainty she had felt that she was going to die, and then Logan had appeared, strong and sure, pulling her from the water and into this new life. It felt like providence, like some force larger than themselves had orchestrated their meeting. I love you, she whispered into the darkness. I love you too, Logan replied, his arms tightening around her. More than I thought I could love anyone. Winter in the mountains was everything Logan had warned her about and more. The snow piled higher than Theodora had imagined possible, sometimes reaching the eaves of the cabin. For weeks at a time they were completely isolated, unable to travel down to Mineral Park or anywhere else. The work of survival was constant, keeping the fire going, melting snow for water, checking the shed to make sure Logan's mule and the 2 horses were warm and fed. But there was beauty in it too. Theodora had never seen the world so pristine, so silent. On clear nights, the stars were so bright and numerous they looked like someone had thrown diamonds across black velvet. The northern lights sometimes danced green and purple across the sky, a phenomenon Logan said appeared only in the coldest weather, and there was Logan himself, revealed more fully now that they shared every hour of every day. Theodora discovered that he sang quietly while doing chores, old songs his mother had taught him, that he was surprisingly good at cooking, capable of making tender venison stew and passable biscuits. That he had nightmares sometimes about being alone in the cold, and he would wake gasping and reach for her to make sure she was real. She learned the rhythms of his body and mind, the things that made him laugh and the topics that made him go quiet and thoughtful. She learned that he was fiercely protective but also surprisingly gentle, capable of great tenderness despite his rough life. And she learned that she had made the right choice in marrying him, even on the days when cabin fever made her want to scream with frustration at being trapped inside. To keep from going mad during the long winter, Theodora organized Logan's small collection of remaining books and read aloud to him in the evenings. They worked through Dickens's Great Expectations, taking turns reading chapters. Logan proved to have a talent for voices, making Miss Havisham sound appropriately creepy and Pip suitably earnest. You could have been an actor, Theodora teased one evening. Too many people, Logan said immediately. Can you imagine me on a stage in front of hundreds of strangers? No, Theodora admitted. But you are good at this. That is because my audience is you, Logan said, only you. They made love frequently during those long winter months, learning each other's bodies with the same careful attention they gave to everything else. Logan was an attentive lover, always making sure Theodora was satisfied before seeking his own pleasure. And Theodora discovered that her serious mountain man had a playful side in the bedroom that left her breathless and laughing. By the time spring finally began to loosen winter's grip on the mountains, Theodora knew she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but the morning she woke feeling nauseated and dizzy, she was certain. She told Logan over breakfast, watching his face carefully for his reaction. He went very still, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. Then slowly, carefully, he set the cup down and came around the table to kneel beside her chair. "Are you sure?" His voice was rough with emotion. "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor. But yes, I am sure." Logan rested his forehead against her belly and Theodora felt his shoulders shake. It took her a moment to realize he was crying, this strong man who had survived so much hardship and loss. "Hey," she said softly, running her fingers through his dark hair. "This is good news, is it not?" "The best news," Logan managed, his voice muffled against her dress. I never thought I would have this. A wife, a child, a family. I thought I would die alone in these mountains." "Well, you will not," Theodora said firmly. "You are stuck with me now, and soon there will be 3 of us." Logan looked up at her, his gray eyes wet but shining with joy. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes. I know. I love you the same way." As soon as the trails were passable, they made the journey down to Mineral Park so Theodora could see Dr. Morrison and confirm her pregnancy. The doctor was encouraging, saying she looked healthy and strong, and he estimated the baby would come in early autumn. Margaret was beside herself with excitement, immediately beginning to plan and organize. She insisted on teaching Theodora how to make proper baby clothes and helped her gather the supplies they would need. Samuel presented Logan with a beautifully crafted cradle he had been building in secret, made from pine and polished smooth as glass. "For my niece or nephew," Samuel said gruffly, clearly emotional. Logan shook his hand wordlessly, too moved to speak. They spent 2 weeks in town, Logan working his claim during the day and sleeping at Samuel and Margaret's house at night. It was odd being around so many people after the isolation of winter, but also refreshing. Theodora found herself enjoying conversations with Margaret and Dorothy, sharing news and gossip and discussing the practical details of pregnancy. But she also found herself eager to return to the cabin. Somewhere over the long winter, the isolated mountain home had become truly hers, a place where she felt safe and loved. She missed the absolute quiet, the starry nights, the intimate closeness of having only Logan for company. When they finally packed up and headed back up the mountain, Theodora felt like she was going home in a way she had not since leaving St. Louis all those months ago. Summer in the mountains was glorious. The meadows burst into bloom with wildflowers, lupine and paintbrush and columbine. The creeks ran high with snowmelt, cold and clear. Logan worked his claim steadily, pulling out enough gold to keep them comfortable. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch and watch the sun set over the distant peaks. Theodora's hand resting on her growing belly while Logan told their unborn child stories about the mountains and the animals that lived there. "You are going to be a wonderful father," Theodora said one such evening. "I hope so. I did not exactly have the best example. Your father loved you, you have said so yourself. He did in his way. But he was hard, Theodora. He never told me he was proud of me or that he loved me. I only knew because of the things he did, not the things he said. I want to be different with our child." "Then you will be," Theodora said simply. "Because you are aware of it and you want to change it. That is the difference." Logan reached over and took her hand, pressing it to his lips. "What did I do to deserve you?" "You jumped in a river," Theodora reminded him with a smile. "Best decision I ever made." As Theodora's pregnancy advanced, Logan became almost comically protective. He would not let her lift anything heavier than a book, insisted she rest frequently, and worried constantly about whether she was eating enough. Theodora found it both endearing and exasperating. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," she said after Logan tried to prevent her from gathering eggs from the chickens he had purchased in spring. "I know, but what if you slip? What if something happens? Then you will be right here to catch me as always." But privately, Theodora appreciated his care, even when it was excessive. She knew it came from a place of deep love and fear of loss. Logan had already lost everyone he had ever cared about: his mother, his father, the few friends he had made over the years who had moved on or died. She was his whole world now, along with their coming child, and the thought of losing either of them terrified him. The baby came on a warm September evening, just as the aspens were beginning to turn gold. Theodora's labor started in the afternoon, and by nightfall she was in the serious business of bringing a new life into the world. Logan had ridden down to Mineral Park 2 days earlier to fetch Margaret, who had experience as a midwife, so Theodora was not alone with only her panicked husband for help. Margaret was calm and competent throughout the long night, guiding Theodora through the contractions and reassuring Logan when he looked like he might faint. The birth was hard but not complicated, and just before dawn a baby's cry rang out in the cabin. "A girl," Margaret announced, wrapping the squalling infant in a clean blanket. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Logan took the baby with shaking hands, looking down at his daughter with an expression of such pure wonder that Theodora felt tears stream down her face. He was transformed in that moment, all his rough edges softened by love. "She is perfect," he whispered. "Theodora, she is perfect." "Let me see her," Theodora said, exhausted but eager to hold her daughter. Logan carefully placed the baby in Theodora's arms, and she looked down at the tiny face, the rosebud mouth, the downy dark hair that was clearly from Logan's side. Her daughter, their daughter. "What should we name her?" Logan asked. They had discussed names throughout the pregnancy but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at this new little person, Theodora knew exactly what felt right. "Sarah," she said. "After your mother." Logan's face crumpled and he buried his face in Theodora's shoulder, his whole body shaking with sobs. Margaret quietly excused herself to give them privacy, and Theodora held both her husband and her daughter, feeling more complete than she had ever imagined possible. When Logan finally composed himself, he looked at Theodora with red-rimmed eyes. "Thank you," he said hoarsely, "for everything, for loving me, for marrying me, for giving me this family. I do not have words for what it means." "You do not need words," Theodora said softly. "I know." Little Sarah proved to be a healthy, alert baby with a good set of lungs. Logan was besotted from the start, holding her whenever he was not actively working, singing the old songs his mother had taught him in a soft rumble that seemed to soothe the baby better than anything else. Margaret stayed for a week to help Theodora recover and adjust to motherhood, then reluctantly returned to Mineral Park with promises to visit again soon. Left alone with their daughter, Logan and Theodora settled into new rhythms. Theodora would wake in the night to feed Sarah, and Logan would get up with her, building up the fire and sitting beside them while Theodora nursed, his hand resting protectively on Sarah's small back. "I never thought I could be this happy," Logan admitted one such night, his voice quiet in the darkness. "It actually frightens me sometimes. Like it is too good to be real and I will wake up and find out it was all a dream." "It is real," Theodora assured him. "We are real. This life we have built together is real and solid, and it is not going anywhere." As Sarah grew from newborn to infant, the cabin began to feel smaller. Logan started planning an addition, another room that could serve as a bedroom for Sarah when she was older and perhaps future children. He worked on it whenever he had spare time, cutting and shaping logs with the same careful attention he gave to everything. Theodora, meanwhile, began teaching again. Several families in the area had heard about the school teacher who lived up on the mountain, and they started sending their children to her for lessons. It was irregular. Some weeks she would have 5 students, other weeks none at all, depending on weather and farm work schedules, but it was teaching, and it filled Theodora with purpose and joy. She held lessons on the porch when weather permitted, using Logan's mother's books and materials she had ordered from Denver. The children sat on log benches Logan had built, and they learned reading and arithmetic and geography while Sarah napped in her cradle nearby. Logan would sometimes stop his own work to listen, and Theodora noticed he paid particular attention when she taught history or science. One day she caught him taking notes. "What are you doing?" she asked, amused. "Learning," Logan said without embarrassment. "My mother taught me basics, but there is a lot I do not know. Figured if I am going to help Sarah with her lessons eventually, I should probably know more." Theodora fell in love with him all over again in that moment. This rough mountain man determined to better himself so he could be a good father to their daughter. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons. Winter's isolation and summer's bounty, spring's renewal and autumn's preparation. Sarah grew into a bright, curious child who loved the mountains as much as her father did. She learned to identify animal tracks before she could read, and she could name every wildflower in the high meadows by her 3rd summer. When Sarah was 4, Theodora gave birth to twin boys Thomas and Timothy, dark-haired like their father and sister but with Theodora's brown eyes. Logan was overwhelmed and delighted in equal measure, pacing the porch with a twin in each arm and singing his mother's old songs. The cabin, now with Logan's addition completed, felt full in the best possible way. Full of life and laughter and love. Full of children's voices and Logan's deep rumble and Theodora's reading aloud in the evenings. Full of all the things that made a house a home. Theodora's informal mountain school grew as well, until she was teaching a dozen students from families scattered throughout the region. Samuel and Margaret came up once a month, bringing supplies and news from town and doting on their niece and nephews. The isolation that might have driven some women mad became Theodora's sanctuary, a place where she could focus on what truly mattered: her family, her teaching, her love. Logan's claim never made them rich, but it provided enough to keep them comfortable and allow for small luxuries. He bought Theodora books whenever he could find them, building her a library that rivaled any in the territory. She bought him tools and equipment that made his work easier, and together they built a life of simple contentment. On their 10th wedding anniversary, they took the children down to Mineral Park for a celebration. The town had grown considerably in the decades since the Ferry disaster. There was a proper church now and a real school building where a young teacher from Philadelphia taught 40 students. The ferry had been rebuilt and operated safely, though Theodora still felt a twist of anxiety every time she looked at the river. They had dinner at Samuel and Margaret's house, now full of their own grandchildren from their son who had returned from California and settled nearby. The table was crowded and loud with conversation and laughter, and Theodora looked around at the family they had become, not just she and Logan and their children, but Samuel and Margaret and all the connections they had formed over the years. Happy? Logan asked, his hand finding hers under the table. Deliriously, Theodora said. That night, back in the hotel room Samuel had insisted on paying for, Logan and Theodora lay together in the darkness while their children slept in the adjoining room. Do you ever regret it? Logan asked quietly. Giving up the life you could have had? Teaching in a real school, living in town, having an easier life? Never, Theodora said firmly. This is the life I chose, and I would choose it again 1,000 times over. You gave me something far more precious than ease or convenience, Logan. You gave me love and family and purpose. You gave me everything that matters. You saved me, Logan said, his voice rough with emotion. The day I pulled you from that river, I thought I was saving you, but you are the one who saved me. From loneliness and bitterness and slowly becoming less human. You reminded me what it means to live instead of just survive. Theodora kissed him, pouring a decade of love and gratitude into the gesture. We saved each other, she said when they finally parted. That is what love does. They made love quietly, mindful of the children in the next room, and afterward lay tangled together in the narrow hotel bed. Outside, Mineral Park continued its rough frontier existence, but in this small room Theodora and Logan had carved out their own private paradise. The next morning, they took the children to see the new schoolhouse. It was a substantial building of wood and stone, with real desks and a blackboard and windows that let in plenty of light. The young teacher, Miss Patricia Williams, was delighted to meet the legendary Mrs. Xavier, the teacher who lived on the mountain. Your reputation precedes you, Miss Williams said warmly. The children you have taught are among my best students. Whatever you are doing up there is working. I just use what I was given, Theodora said, thinking of Logan's mother's books and the love of learning she had inherited from her own mother. And I have the advantage of small classes and individual attention. They talked for a while about teaching methods and materials, and Miss Williams showed Theodora the new books the school had received from a charity organization in Boston. Theodora felt a small pang of envy. These books were beautiful and comprehensive, far better than the worn volumes she used, but it was fleeting. She had what mattered most. As they were leaving, Miss Williams called out, Mrs. Xavier, if you are ever interested, I could use an assistant teacher. The school board has authorized a second position if we can find someone qualified. Theodora paused, tempted despite herself. Then she felt Logan's presence beside her, solid and sure, and thought of their cabin in the mountains, of Sarah and Thomas and Timothy, of the life they had built together. Thank you, she said sincerely, but my place is with my family, on our mountain. I appreciate the offer, though. Walking back to Samuel's house, Logan squeezed her hand. You could have said yes. If you wanted to teach in town, we could work something out. Move down here, or you could stay with Sam and Margaret during the week. I do not want that, Theodora said. I want exactly what I have: you and our children and our home. The teaching I do is enough, more than enough. You are sure? Completely. They spent another 2 days in Mineral Park, visiting friends and restocking supplies, before making the journey back up the mountain. As the cabin came into view, Sarah let out a whoop of joy and ran ahead, followed by her brothers toddling as fast as their short legs could carry them. They love it here as much as we do, Logan observed. Of course they do. It is home. That night, with the children asleep and the fire burning low, Theodora and Logan sat on the porch as they had so many times before. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and somewhere in the distance a wolf howled. Logan had his arm around Theodora, and she leaned into his warmth, feeling utterly content. Tell me the story again, Logan said softly. What story? How we met? The ferry, the river, all of it. Theodora smiled. It had become a tradition of sorts, retelling the story of their beginning. She suspected Logan liked to hear it as confirmation that their love was real, that the happiness they had built could not be taken away. The ferry took on water mid-river, Theodora began, her voice soft in the mountain darkness. I was certain I was going to die, and I remember thinking how unfair it was to come all this way only to drown before reaching my destination. Then I saw you. I saw you too, Logan interjected, as he always did at this point in the story. Standing there trying to help that old woman, scared but not panicking. I knew in that moment I was going to save you or die trying. You swam me to shore before the boatman stopped yelling, Theodora continued, smiling at the memory despite the terror it had held at the time. You held me so tight I could barely breathe, but I felt safer than I ever had in my life. Like nothing could hurt me as long as you were there. And then you carried me to the bank and spent the next hour saving other people, never once thinking about yourself. And I watched you and thought, that is the kind of man I could love. I did not know yet that I already did. Logan pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Best day of my life, even though it was terrifying at the time. If that ferry had not sunk, I never would have met you. We would have passed each other like strangers and gone our separate ways. Do you really believe that? That we never would have found each other otherwise? Logan was quiet for a moment, considering. No, he finally said. I think we would have found each other somehow. Maybe not that day, maybe not in that way, but eventually. Some things are just meant to be. I believe that too, Theodora said softly. They sat in comfortable silence for a while longer, watching the stars and listening to the night sounds of the mountain. Inside, their children slept safely. Around them, the life they had built together continued its steady rhythm. Below in the valley, Mineral Park carried on with its rough frontier existence. And here, in this small cabin carved out of wilderness and determination, two people who had saved each other continued to choose love every single day. Years continued to pass, marked by the changing seasons and the growing of their children. Sarah grew into a tall, capable young woman who loved the mountains as fiercely as her father did. She learned to track and hunt and prospect, but she also inherited her mother's love of learning. By the time she was 16, she was helping Theodora teach the younger students, showing a natural talent for explaining difficult concepts. The twins, Thomas and Timothy, were 7 when their youngest sibling arrived, a surprise baby girl whom they named Margaret, after Theodora's beloved cousin's wife. Logan was 42 by then, his dark hair now streaked with silver, but he was still powerfully built and capable. He took the news of the 4th child with the same wonder he had shown with Sarah. How did I get so lucky? He asked, holding tiny Margaret in his calloused hands while the twins peered at their new sister with fascination. You jumped in a river, Theodora reminded him, as she always did, and Logan laughed his rough laugh that still made her heart flutter after all these years. Samuel and Margaret, the original Margaret, had grown old and comfortable, their son and his family nearby to help them. Samuel had trained his son to take over the assay business, and now they both ran it together. The older Margaret's health had declined in recent years, and when she passed quietly in her sleep in the spring of Theodora and Logan's 15th year of marriage, it felt like losing a mother. They brought all 4 children down for the funeral, Logan carrying little Margaret while Sarah herded the twins. The entire town turned out to pay respects to a woman who had been a pillar of the community, and afterwards Samuel pulled Logan aside. I want you to have this, Samuel said, pressing something into Logan's hand. It was Margaret's wedding ring, simple gold worn smooth by decades of wear. Sam, I cannot. She would have wanted Theodora to have it. You know she loved your wife like a daughter, please. That night, in the hotel room, Logan gave Theodora the ring. She slipped it onto her right hand. Her left already wore the simple band Logan had given her at their wedding, and wept for the woman who had welcomed her to Arizona territory, helped her find her place and become family. We are the old generation now, Theodora realized. We are the ones the young people come to for advice and help. A terrifying thought, Logan said, but he smiled. When Sarah turned 18, a young man from one of the mining families began courting her. His name was James Peterson, and he was a good man, hard-working, honest, and clearly devoted to Sarah. Logan was predictably protective, interrogating the poor young man thoroughly before allowing him to take Sarah on chaperoned walks. You are being ridiculous, Theodora told her husband after a particularly intense questioning session. I am being thorough. That is my daughter. That is your grown daughter who has a good head on her shoulders and does not need you to vet every potential suitor like he is buying one of your horses. It is different when it is your child, Logan grumbled, but he made an effort to be more welcoming after that. Sarah and James were married in the summer of her 19th year in a ceremony held in the meadow near Logan and Theodora's cabin. It was a beautiful day, with wildflowers blooming and the mountains providing a stunning backdrop. Logan walked his daughter down the makeshift aisle with tears streaming unashamedly down his weathered face. She looks just like my mother did in her wedding photograph, he whispered to Theodora during the ceremony. She is her grandmother's legacy, Theodora agreed, squeezing his hand. The young couple built a cabin not far from Logan and Theodora's, James working a claim near Logan's. It was comforting to have Sarah nearby, especially as she and James started their own family. Their first child, a boy they named Logan, was born when Theodora and Logan's own Margaret was just 2 years old. I am a grandfather, Logan said with wonder, holding his tiny namesake. How did I get old enough to be a grandfather? The same way we all do, Theodora said with amusement, one day at a time. But Logan was not old, not really. At 45, he still worked his claim with the same vigor he had in his youth, still rode and hunted and chopped firewood. His hair had gone mostly silver now, but it suited him, made his storm gray eyes stand out even more. Theodora, at 40, was still teaching her small mountain school, though increasingly Sarah helped her with the lessons. The twins grew into tall, sturdy young men who looked exactly like their father had at that age. They were inseparable, finishing each other's sentences and communicating in the shorthand of twins. When they were 16, they announced plans to head to California to seek their fortune in the goldfields there. Absolutely not, Logan said immediately. Father, we are not asking permission. Thomas said respectfully but firmly. We are telling you our plans. You are 16 years old. You were on your own at 12, Timothy pointed out. Logan looked to Theodora for support, but she shook her head slightly. The boys were right, they were nearly men, and Logan had been even younger when he had been forced to make his own way. It was time to let them try their wings, as painful as that was. If you go, Logan finally said, his voice tight with emotion, you take rifles, plenty of ammunition, and enough money to get you home if things go wrong. And you write to your mother every month, or I will come out there and drag you home by your ears. The twins agreed readily, and 2 months later they set off for California with Logan's reluctant blessing. The house felt empty without them, and Theodora caught Logan staring at their empty beds more than once. They will be fine, she assured him. They have your strength and your survival skills, and they have each other. I know. It is just hard letting them go. This is what we raised them for, to be independent, capable people who can make their own way. When did you get so wise? I married a man who taught me about strength and resilience, Theodora said. I learned from the best. With Sarah married and nearby and the twins in California, Theodora and Logan had more time to focus on young Margaret. Their youngest child was a delightful mix of both her parents' Logan's stubbornness and Theodora's love of learning. At 5 years old, she was already reading simple books and demanding to know the names of every plant and animal she encountered. She is going to be formidable, Logan observed one evening, watching Margaret order her father around while they worked on a project together. She takes after her mother, Theodora said smugly. And thank God for that. On their 20th anniversary, the whole family gathered at the cabin for a celebration. Sarah and James came with their 3 children. The twins had returned from California for the occasion with tales of adventure and modest success in the goldfields, and even Samuel made the trip up the mountain despite his advancing age and arthritis. They feasted on venison and wild turkey, fresh bread and butter, vegetables from Theodora's garden, and a cake Margaret the elder had taught Dorothy to make years ago. The recipe had been passed down and Sarah had perfected it. As the sun set and the children played in the meadow, the adults sat on the expanded porch Logan had built to accommodate gatherings. Samuel raised his glass of whiskey. To Logan and Theodora, he said. 20 years ago, my cousin arrived in Arizona Territory with nothing but hope and a teaching certificate. She lost everything in that ferry disaster. But she gained something far more valuable, a partner, a love, and a life of meaning and purpose. I have watched you two build something remarkable up here. Not just a home, but a legacy. You have raised wonderful children, helped educate countless others, and created a partnership that stands as an example of what marriage should be. To 20 more years, 20 more years, everyone echoed. Raising their glasses, Logan stood, pulling Theodora to her feet beside him. I have never been good with words, he said, his voice rough with emotion. But I need to say this. 20 years ago, I pulled a woman from a river thinking I was saving her life. I did not know that she was saving mine. Theodora, you took a hard, lonely man and taught him how to be human again. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to care about something beyond just surviving another day. Everything good in my life comes from you. Thank you for choosing me, for loving me, for building this life with me. Theodora was crying now, happy tears streaming down her face. You gave me everything I ever wanted without even knowing what that was. A home, a family, meaningful work, and a love that continues to grow deeper every year. I would live this life 1,000 times over if it meant spending it with you. They kissed while their family cheered, and Theodora thought back to that terrified woman on a sinking ferry who had locked eyes with a stranger across chaos and felt something shift in the universe. That moment had led to this one, to 20 years of love and life and growth. The ferry disaster that could have killed her had instead delivered her to exactly where she was meant to be. The years continued their steady march forward. The twins eventually settled in California, though they visited regularly and wrote faithfully as promised. Sarah and James expanded their family to 6 children, creating a boisterous, loving household that reminded Theodora of her own childhood. Young Margaret grew into a brilliant, determined woman who announced at 16 that she wanted to attend the normal school in Flagstaff and become a proper teacher. "I want to teach in a real school," she explained to her parents. "Not that what you do is not real, Mama, but I want to teach in town, reach more students." "I understand completely," Theodora said, meaning it. "That was my original dream too, before the ferry changed everything." "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked seriously. "Not teaching in a real school?" Theodora looked around their cabin, at the life she and Logan had built, at the man himself sitting by the fire and pretending not to listen to their conversation. "Not for a single moment," she said firmly. "But your path does not have to be mine. If you want to teach in town, then we will make that happen." Logan was less enthusiastic about his youngest child leaving home, but he understood that his children had to make their own ways. He paid for Margaret's tuition at the normal school and wrote her long letters full of advice and love, though he would never admit to anyone but Theodora how much he missed having her home. "The house is too quiet," he complained after Margaret had been gone for 3 months. "We still have each other," Theodora reminded him. "I know, and I am grateful for that every day. But I miss the chaos of having children underfoot." As if the universe heard his complaint, Sarah appeared at their door a week later with an unusual request. She and James needed to travel to California to help the twins with a business venture, and they needed someone to watch their 6 children for several months. "Of course," Theodora said immediately, delighted at the prospect of a house full of grandchildren. Logan tried to look put upon, but Theodora could see the excitement in his eyes. For 3 months their cabin was once again filled with children's voices and laughter and the wonderful chaos of family life. Logan taught his grandsons to track and hunt, while Theodora worked on reading and arithmetic with the granddaughters. It was exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. When Sarah and James finally returned, full of tales of successful business dealings with the twins, Logan and Theodora were simultaneously relieved and sad to see the children go. "We are getting too old for this," Logan said, but he was smiling. "Speak for yourself. I could do it again tomorrow." "Liar. I heard you complaining about your aching back just this morning." "Well, yes, but that is different. My heart wants to do it again even if my body protests." They settled back into their quiet routine, just the two of them once more. Logan still worked his claim, though less vigorously than in his youth. At 54, he had to acknowledge that his body did not recover from hard labor as quickly as it once did. Theodora at 49 still taught her small school, though most of her students now were grandchildren of the children she had taught in the early years. On a crisp autumn evening in their 25th year of marriage, Logan and Theodora sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. The aspens were at their peak color, exactly as Logan had described them that first autumn after they met. "Do you remember when I told you about the aspens?" Logan asked, as if reading her thoughts. "I remember everything about that fall. I was already in love with you, but afraid to admit it. I was in love with you from the moment you did not panic when I cut your dress off on that ferry. Most women would have been hysterical, but you just trusted me to keep you safe. You have been keeping me safe for 25 years now, and you have been making me a better man for just as long." Theodora reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining automatically. His hands were more weathered now, the calluses deeper, but his grip was still strong and sure. "What do you think will happen to this place when we are gone?" Logan asked suddenly. "Will Sarah and her family take it over? Will it just be reclaimed by the wilderness? Why are you thinking about such morbid things?" "I am 54 years old. Theodora. I have to start considering these practical matters. You are nowhere near done living, Logan Xavier. We have years left together. I hope so. But if something were to happen to me, I need to know you will be taken care of. Logan, please, let me say this." He turned to face her fully, his storm gray eyes serious in the fading light. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. These 25 years with you have been worth 100 lifetimes of anything else. If I die tomorrow, I die a happy man. But I need to know you will be all right. I will be all right because I will have our children and grandchildren, and because you taught me how to be strong. But you are not dying tomorrow or any time soon, so stop talking like this." Logan smiled and pulled her close. "Yes, madam." They made love that night with the tenderness of long familiarity, their bodies knowing exactly how to please each other after so many years together. Afterward, wrapped in quilts against the autumn chill, Theodora listened to Logan's steady heartbeat and offered up a prayer of gratitude for this life, this love, this man who had saved her in more ways than pulling her from a river. The next morning dawned bright and clear. Logan was up with the sun as always, building up the fire and putting coffee on to boil. Theodora woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, and she lay in bed for a moment just watching her husband move around their cabin with easy familiarity. His hair was silver now, and his face was deeply lined by years of sun and wind, but to her he was still the most handsome man she had ever seen. "I can feel you staring," Logan said without turning around. "I am admiring my husband. Is that a crime? If it is, I hope you get a long sentence." They ate breakfast together as the sun rose higher, painting the world in shades of gold and amber. It was an ordinary morning in an ordinary life, which meant it was extraordinary in all the ways that mattered. Margaret returned from normal school with her teaching certificate and immediately secured a position in the growing town of Flagstaff. She wrote enthusiastic letters about her students and her work, and while Theodora was proud of her daughter, she also felt a pang of nostalgia for her own dreams of teaching in a proper school. "You could still do it, you know," Logan said when she mentioned this. "There is probably always need for teachers. We could move to town if you wanted. And give up our mountain? Never. No, my teaching days are mostly behind me. I am content with the occasional student and mostly being a grandmother." "Are you sure? Because if you want Logan." Theodora took his face in her hands. "I am sure. This is where I want to be, where I have always wanted to be, since the day you brought me here. Stop trying to give me things I do not need or want. I just want you to be happy. I am happy. Deliriously, completely, utterly happy." On their 30th anniversary, the family gathered once again. The celebration was held at Sarah's larger house, since Logan and Theodora's cabin could no longer accommodate the entire extended family, 6 children between Sarah and James, the twins both now with wives and children of their own, and Margaret engaged to a young teacher she had met in Flagstaff. Samuel had passed away the previous year at the age of 78, peacefully in his sleep. The loss had been hard on Theodora, but she took comfort in knowing he had lived a good, long life surrounded by family. His son now ran the assay business, and he still gave Logan favorable rates in memory of the friendship between their fathers. The party was joyous and loud, with grandchildren running everywhere and great-grandchildren, the twins' children, adding to the chaos. Logan stood in the middle of it all, looking slightly overwhelmed but deeply happy. 30 years, he said to Theodora during a brief quiet moment. 3 decades since I pulled you from that river. Best rescue you ever made. The only rescue that mattered. They were in their 60s now, officially old by frontier standards, though both were still relatively healthy and active. Logan's hair was completely white, and his face was weathered like old leather, but his gray eyes were still sharp and his strength, while diminished, was still considerable. Theodora's brown hair had gone gray and then white, and she had put on weight over the years. But Logan still looked at her like she was the most beautiful woman in the world. "I love you," he said suddenly, pulling her close despite the party going on around them. "More now than ever. I did not think that was possible, but it is true." "I love you too," Theodora said, resting her head on his broad chest and listening to the steady beat of his heart, a sound that had comforted her for 3 decades. Always and forever. As the party wound down and the family began to disperse, Logan and Theodora made the journey back up to their cabin. The ride took longer than it used to. Their bodies were not as resilient as they had been, but they made it safely as the sun was setting. Inside their cabin, surrounded by the accumulation of a lifetime together, books and tools and photographs and mementos, they sat by the fire and simply enjoyed being together. "Do you think about it much anymore?" Logan asked. "The ferry that day?" "Sometimes. Usually when I am counting my blessings, I think about how close I came to losing all of this before I ever had it. I think about it too, about how easily I could have not been on that ferry, or not noticed you, or any number of things that would have meant we never met. But we did meet, you did save me, and we built this beautiful life together. No regrets, not a single one, you?" Logan shook his head. "My only regret is that we do not have more time. I want another 30 years with you, another 60, forever. Then we will make the most of whatever time we have," Theodora said firmly, "and we will fill it with love and family and all the good things we have always had." They lived for many more years in their mountain cabin, watching their family grow and expand. They saw Margaret marry her teacher and start a family of their own. They celebrated the twins' success in California and welcomed more grandchildren and great-grandchildren than they could easily count. They taught and loved and lived, each day a gift they never took for granted. When Logan finally passed away at the age of 71, it was peacefully in his sleep, lying beside Theodora in the bed they had shared for over 40 years. Theodora woke to find him gone, and while her heart broke with the loss, she also felt a deep gratitude that he had been spared suffering. that he had died in the home he loved beside the woman who had loved him. She buried him on the mountainside in a spot he had chosen years earlier, a place where you could see for miles in every direction. At the funeral, attended by what seemed like half of Arizona territory, Theodora stood beside the grave and told one final time the story of how they met. "The ferry took on water mid-river," she began, her voice steady despite her tears. "And a mountain man swam me to shore before the boatman stopped yelling. That mountain man became my husband, my partner, my greatest love. He saved my life that day, and he continued to save it every day after by giving me a reason to live fully and love deeply. He was the finest man I have ever known, and I will love him until my dying breath and beyond." Theodora lived for 3 more years after Logan's death, staying in their cabin despite her children's urging to move closer to town. She continued to teach occasionally, sharing Logan's mother's books with yet another generation of children. But mostly she simply lived quietly, reading and remembering and treasuring the decades she had been blessed to share with Logan Xavier. When she passed away in her 74th year, also peacefully in her sleep, her children buried her beside Logan on the mountainside. On the shared headstone, they carved a simple inscription, "Logan Xavier and Theodora Langford Xavier." She pulled him from loneliness. He pulled her from the river. Together they built a love that conquered wilderness and time. And years later, when their great-great-grandchildren asked about the couple buried on the mountain, someone would always tell the story. The story of the ferry that took on water mid-river and the mountain man who swam a woman to shore before the boatman stopped yelling. The story of a love born from disaster and forged in the wild frontier, a love that endured for decades and left a legacy that continued long after they were gone. Because the best love stories are not about perfection or ease, but about 2 people who choose each other every day despite difficulties and hardships. Logan and Theodora had built that kind of love, and it rippled through generations, touching everyone who heard their tale and reminding them that sometimes the worst moments of our lives can lead to the very best, if we are brave enough to jump in the river and swim for shore.